Welcome to the Foundations of Learning podcast, where we believe every child deserves a tailored and enriching educational experience. By embracing diverse perspectives and sharing practical tips, I hope to inspire you to actively participate in your child's learning journey, fostering a love for knowledge and nurturing the skills necessary for success in a rapidly changing world. Let's get started.
Welcome back to the podcast. So today I'm going to address the question, is my child too young to learn how to read? Or should I teach my young child to read? When should I start teaching them to read? Is it detrimental to them? What we're going to talk about today is what is actually happening in your child's brain. So what developmental milestones are happening from ages 0 to about 10, and whether or not you should teach your young child to read. There is a lot of information out there on the internet about teaching young children to read, not teaching young children to read. It's detrimental to teach them. It's not detrimental to teach them. You should do this. And so I'm just going to go through and really just, like I said, look at what the brain is doing, because that really is the most important piece. Even when we're looking at teaching a child to read, we now have neuroscience on what is actually happening in the brain, what parts of the brain are actually making connections to effectively read and write. And so if we are looking at this in a sense of what is their brain doing, it's going to be a lot more helpful for you to make a decision on whether or not you want to teach your child to read at a young age. I do want to preface this by saying that every single child is different. Every single child is going to hit milestones at like a different rate. And depending upon like your child's oral language and things like that will also depend whether or not you do this. But ultimately, as the parent, it is up to you what you do. If you teach your young child to read, it's not going to be detrimental for them, although there are foundational skills that I do believe and also research supports that you should do at the younger age. And this will help them to become good readers and writers in the future. All right, so when we are looking at the development of a child, the number one thing I want to talk about is that it is so important that your child is involved in play and movement because there are certain gross and fine motor skills that need to develop in order for them to be good readers and writers. For example, which I will get more into detail about, but like eye muscles, neck muscles, your inner ear, your fine motor skills. So that's like being able to like button up your own pants or zip up your jacket, tie your shoes, different things like that. Even if you were to have them help you if you were baking, right, and they're kneading the dough or whatever it is, there are a lot of muscles that need to develop in order for them to first like to read and track words, and then also to be able to like hold a pencil and write, right? So there is a lot of different things that need to happen. So when we are looking at early literacy skills and if you are teaching a young child to read, it's important that you are incorporating play, movement, multisensory activities to practice these essential foundational skills, just to help them become a reader and writer when that time comes. I also want to mention that at the very end of this podcast, after we go through what's happening in the brain, I am going to discuss the foundational skills that I do believe you need to be practicing with your child, even before we put letters and have them segment and blend words to actually begin reading. So I will give you action steps at the very end. So we're going to talk about what is the brain doing. 90% of the brain growth happens before a child even reaches kindergarten. Now, yes, it is their brain growth, but the most important piece is actually the connections that they are making, because the connections or the synapses that they are making in their brain are actually what makes the brain work. So a newborn baby has all of the brain cells or neurons that they will have for the rest of their life. But like I said, it is the connections between those neurons that actually make the brain work and are the most important piece. So in early childhood, at least 1 million new neural connections or synapses are made every second. So people generally say early childhood is about from ages 0 to 8. So that is insane. That is so many neural connections. And I mean, really, if you are practicing specific things with your child, like those are the neural connections that are going to be made, right? And then also just in their day-to-day life of playing and movement and things like that will also create these new neural connections. So it's pretty amazing. Their brain is so malleable. So this is really the time that it is important that they are learning foundational skills. So I do want to make the preface, like I had said, that every child is different and they develop at different rates, but a child is making connections, like I said, in their movement, their language, their emotion, and they are going to develop at different rates depending upon the environment that they are surrounded in, what you are doing with them, and so on. So when we look at learning, everything we learn is like building a house. As we make new connections, these connections build upon each other. So the new learned skills can become more complex, right? So in the beginning, your child is doing tummy time, right? So that they can hold their head up. And then after they can hold their head up, now they're going to start using their arms to try to push themselves up so they can start to crawl. So then their arm muscles and their leg muscles grow. And then once they start crawling, then they start to try to pull themselves up so that they can stand up, right? And then they start trying to walk. Like everything they're doing is building upon each other so that they can make it more complex. Now, that is the exact same thing that we want to do when we're teaching them academic skills or when we're building their self-regulation or whatever it is that they are working on. We have to build upon that. And that's why, toddlers, little or babies' toys, they have the things where they have to pick something up and try to fit it into a certain, shape or whatever. And they fit all the triangles in and all the circles in, and that's going to work on their fine motor skills. And then eventually, if they've worked on their fine motor skills, they can then, use that to try to button up their own pants or to zip up their jacket or to learn to tie their shoes or whatever it is. But it's going to build upon each other, just as if you were building a house, right? You have to do the foundation and then you put up the wall and so on, right? So you have to think about that as you are looking at the stages of the child and what's happening in their brain, and understanding that things have to happen first before you can do, like A has to happen before you can do B, right? So children are learning via their environment. They are learning things like motivation, self-regulation, problem-solving, communication, social cues, movement of their body, etc., oral language, all of that good stuff, right? So their everyday experience is where their learning is going to take place. So that is why it's so important that you talk with your child. You encourage them to speak as well. And you just give them ample amount of opportunity for them to speak or listen to a lot of books. Audiobooks are amazing for this. Read to them. There's so many things that you can do to help build their oral language, because that's going to be the biggest piece in teaching your child to read and to write. They have to have a large vocabulary. All right, so let's talk about what is happening in the brain. What are these stages? And then we're going to go in and talk about what is happening in the brain when we are reading and which parts of the brain we need to be able to read and write effectively, and kind of correlate those to what is happening at each age in the brain. If you do want to look at any of these resources as well, I do put them in my show notes. So if you ever want to go look at the research articles that I'm talking about or where I'm getting my information, I will leave the links at the bottom of my show notes so that you can see those as well. All right, so let's talk about birth and infancy. So this is the sensory-motor stage. So we are working on basic reflexes for survival. So rooting, sucking, grasping, right? This is all of the things that they need to make sure that they can survive, right? They're going to cry. They are going to cry to let you know that they need to feed, and they are going to work on their sucking skills, or their grasping, right? They're going to grasp your hair and so on. Like that is the basic reflexes that they're working on, and that is birth, infancy. So from 0 to 2, although they are working on these reflexes for survival, they are also establishing trusting relationships. This is their motor development. So they're going to start raising their head at 1 month, sitting up without support at like 6 months, walking alone at about 12 months. Again, these are just averages. It can differ depending on the child. They're exploring their environment and they're learning from it, and they're starting to build vocabulary. And so you're going to have, that's when toddlers start to try to say like one thing, right? They might try to say milk and they might say it incorrectly, but they're saying milk. They're going to say mom, dad, whatever, right? Obviously in the beginning, they just start with cooing and doing different like babbles and stuff like that. And then it produces into actual words if you're working with them, right? Like, so the words that you are providing them within their environment, they're going to start saying, right? So if you're like milk and you're showing them milk and they start to recognize, oh, that's how you say milk, right? And then they start to say it and so on. So that's really what's happening from 0 to 2. And then from 2 to 4, the brain is actually at 80% of the adult size by the time they're 4 years old. And then again, by the time they're about 5, it's about 90%. But they are starting to learn more complex skills like hopping and skipping. Fine motor skills continue to develop past just grasping, right? So in the beginning, babies will just grab things, but now they're starting to have more development like in their fingers and stuff to where they can actually try to use like the pincer grasp, right? And pick things up with their finger and their thumb. Like it's becoming more complex than just grasping. They are starting to learn how to speak in short sentences. They begin participating in more dramatic play. So this is going to be like role play. They might have imaginary friends. This is really the safety aspect of like their survival skills. So this is why they say no, because everything around them is essentially to them unsafe unless the parent is present. And even if the parent is present, they may still say no to the parent. And this is just them in their brain because of the side of the brain that's developing. They're in their no stage. So everything's going to be no, right? Even if they did want it, it's going to be a no. And then it's also exploring the world and understanding the world. So again, the environment they are in is so important. So if you do want to expose your child to, the foundational skills they need in reading and writing, well, you need to have things that they can use to learn how to grab, whether it be dot paints or crayons or markers or whatever it is, right? Let them use those to draw. Or for example, reading to them, that is going to be super important. Having books around the house all the time. This is going to be something that they will choose if they have it available to them, right? And there's those toddler books that has like the letters in it, and that starts to teach them concepts of print. So the environment is very important in what you have there to help them to build their foundational skills. And then we go to ages 4 to 7, where this is going to be where they start to understand a little bit more about like self-care, cooperative play. So like in 2 to 4, they're going to do more like parallel play. So they're not really playing with each other. Yes, they might fight over toys and things like that, but they're not really playing together. They're playing next to each other. So this child is doing their own thing and this child's doing their own thing, but they're like in the same vicinity and they're playing, right? But when we get to 4 to 7, they do more cooperative play. So this is where they're actually going to want to play with friends. And this can start earlier too. Like I have seen like 3-year-olds, where they want to, if they have older siblings, they kind of start to play with others a little bit sooner. So I have seen that. But generally from 4 to 7, this is when they're really participating in that cooperative play where, maybe they're playing house together and one person's the mom and one person's the dad and one, whatever it is. And so they start to actually cooperatively play together and come up with their own little games that they're playing. This is also when they start to do more competitive play. So this is when your child might be a little bit more engaged in like sports and things like that because they like to have that, competition of trying to beat each other. This is also when they might start to really show engagement in wanting to play games with you, and so on. And you can use that to learn with your child, right? You can use that competitive play, in games and things like that to play with letters and to play with high frequency words and whatever it is, you can use that to your advantage. This is also when they start asking questions and want to know why things are the way they are. So the why is it like that? Why is the sky blue? Why are the clouds like that? Why does the earth look like that? Whatever it is, this is their why stage. This is when they are really trying to grasp why things are the way that they are in their world. Beforehand, they were just exploring things. And yes, they're still trying to understand why things are, but now they have the actual, from 4 to 7, the oral vocabulary to be able to ask these questions, So before it was just them exploring. Now they're actually going to go more into depth about why things are the way that they are. And then their gross and fine motor skills are becoming obviously more developed, more complex. And then from ages 7 to 9, this is when their gross and fine motor skills are, like I said, more developed, more complex. Their worldview becomes more realistic and less fantasy oriented. Their cognitive functions are more efficient, so their word recall and reading actually becomes easier at this point in time. And then also they develop their inductive reasoning, so they can more draw conclusions, right? So they can observe something, they can see the pattern recognition, and then come to a general conclusion of what might be happening in that. And that's from ages 7 to 9. So I do want to make a heavy emphasis on the cognitive function becoming more efficient, because really all that reading is they have to have a memory. Yes, we're not memorizing words like this is the word cat. What does this word say? We're giving them strategies on how to actually effectively read these words by teaching them the letter sounds, teaching them how to segment those sounds, how to blend them together. And then we obviously become more complex to where, the vowels start to change and they now say a long sound or a short sound, and they have to identify why it's saying it's long sound or short sound. So they still have to have the memory because they have to remember what the letter sounds are, what the letters look like. They have to remember how to produce these letters when they're writing them. They have to understand, what a vowel team is and what the vowel teams are and what those patterns are saying. So they still have to have that recall to be able to effectively read and to write. Now, as a first grade teacher, I can tell you I saw this shift a lot. At the very beginning of the year, my students were not as fluent of readers. I even had kids that they were good readers, but they just weren't as fluent, or they would forget things more frequently. Whereas at the very end of the year, the shift that would happen was crazy. Like the kids that even like middle of year was always like that turning point where kids started to go more from really hard segmenting and blending to more whole words being read, and also their fluency and their comprehension of what they're reading started to shift middle of year, which at the end of the year, they're, 7 years old. And so I saw that with my own eyes, that reading and writing became a lot easier for them. And that is due to the fact that in their brain, their cognitive functioning is becoming more efficient. They have better recall. And so that is something that I want you to be aware of when we are talking about, should I teach a child to read? All right. Now, like I said, when I was saying like word recall and stuff, like really I'm focusing more on like that fluent reading. And so can younger children remember their letters, and can they segment very simple words and blend them back together? Yeah, they probably can. But are they going to sound like fluent readers super early on? It's going to depend on the child. And like I said, their cognitive recall is not as efficient. So like I said, it's kind of this weird line that you have to decide as a parent, like, do I want to teach them this? Is it going to make it more of is it going to make it more frustrating for my child if I teach them a little too early? Like I said, that's totally up to you, and it's for you to watch your child. Like if you are working on these things and you're realizing like, okay, we're kind of stuck, we're not like really getting any further, maybe that's okay with the stage that they're at. And you have to look at that as the parent and say, okay, maybe I'm pushing them a little past what their brain is actually capable of at this moment, right? And it, like I said, again, you can make connections in the brain and it will just strengthen those connections earlier than later, right? And like I said, their brain is very malleable at a very young age. So like I said, there's always going to be like this push and pull when we're looking at what is going to be best. And I feel like also like research is always like trying to fit people in a box. And all of us are so different that I think it's important to understand that like we can't fit everyone in a box as well, and everybody is different. All right, so as you can see, children are learning a lot. There's a lot that they are doing when they are developing, right? Like they're developing movement, emotional regulation, self-regulation. They're developing language. They're developing an understanding of the world. And just so much is happening. So they are learning a lot. So let's talk about what needs to be developed to actually be a good reader and writer. So what is important in their like actual body when we're talking about muscles is their eye and neck muscles have to be developed. And when I say their eye and neck muscles, obviously their neck muscles, like if they can hold their head up, obviously, right? And if they can turn their head. But one important thing is it really makes me think of like a cop when they're doing a DUI like check thingy, and they have the people like follow their finger or whatever, and they tell them they can't turn their head to watch their finger, right? They have to follow it with their eyes. That is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about their eye muscles, because when we are reading, we have to be able to track the words with our eyes, right? Now, like if you're tracking with your head like this, it's going to be a lot harder. Your words are going to start to get a little bit blurry if you're trying to like move your head and read, right? Whereas if you're moving your eyes back and forth, you're not going to get like that weird blurry dizziness feel. So one thing you can practice with your child is you could just have them follow your finger or follow a pen or whatever it is, and have them practice like following things with just their eyes and see if they can even do it. Like maybe they still can't do it and they try to move their head. And if you try to have them keep their head straight, and do it with your finger, that is a part of what we need to be able to do to read. We have to be able to track with our eyes, right? And then also the inner ear. The inner ear has to be developed, which the inner ear is really important because this is the part of our senses that actually gives us an understanding of our body in the space around us. And so if you've ever, that's why kids love to spin too. And that is one thing, if you want the inner ear to develop, like spinning is a great way to do it. When your kid wants you to throw them up in the air, that's also a good way to develop it. All of the things that we kind of naturally do with our kids is going to help them to develop their inner ear. But the inner ear is very important. And I'm going to read a quote about the eye muscles and neck muscles and why it's so important. But it is important in their reading and writing. And then also their hand muscles. So we do have a muscle in our hand that really doesn't develop fully until I think they're about 5.5. And so children often, that's why they hold the pencil with a grasp instead of holding it like we would say you need, to correctly hold your pencil or whatever. And I would say when we're talking about how to hold a pencil, if your child is holding it in a way that like to you is not the correct way, with their finger and their thumb, and then, they support it with their middle finger type of a deal. That's generally how we teach kids to hold a pencil. But if they're holding it in a different way and it's comfortable for them to hold it that way, and their handwriting, you can read their handwriting, then it's really not that big of a deal. Like you don't have to have a kid hold a pencil in a very specific way. Like if it's comfortable for them, you can read their handwriting and it's not hindering, like it doesn't hurt their hand to hold it that way. Totally fine. The only thing I would say is watch, because some kids do have like double joints in their fingers, and some kids will try to hold it with like their finger, their middle finger, or their pointer finger, their middle finger, and their ring finger and their thumb. And then their fingers like just like it's like their fingers double joint, and the kids that try to hold their pencils like that, their handwriting looks real rough. Like it's really hard for them to produce letters, and it's actually very frustrating for them. So those kids, I would suggest, even the young kids, when you're first teaching a kid to write, is I would make sure you get like a fat pencil, and you can buy those. I can put a link in the show notes as well to these pencils I'm talking about, and pencil grips. Those really, really help your child to start to get that it helps them to hold the pencil correctly and build that muscle strength. Because when we're trying to use a pencil that's really, really skinny, when their muscle is not quite developed, it's really hard for them. And I honestly would not suggest to try to push your child in holding their pencil correctly when they're super, super young, just because that muscle isn't developed. So it can get very frustrating. They might get, start bad habits and things like that. So like I said, all things have their push and their pull. But it's totally up to you. Like I said, if you use those fatter pencils or pencil grip, it can help as well if you are trying to get them to hold a pencil correctly at a younger age. And then the word form area of the brain also needs to be developed. So the word form area is going to actually be like that cognitive function where the word recall happens, which again, from what the research that I've looked at, it's from about 6 to 7 is when that part of the brain starts to develop, and so they become more efficient. Now, like I said, that does not mean that they cannot learn letter sounds. I mean, it's the same thing if you think about they start to learn their shapes and they start to learn their colors, and they start to learn like, this is a cat, this is a dog, and the cat says meow and the dog says whatever, right? So they can learn things, and the word form area of your brain is actually the part of your brain that is going to recognize like shapes and faces and objects and things like that. So I'm not saying they can't do that. It's just that it becomes more efficient by the time they're 6 or 7. And so that's when it's really starting to develop and become more efficient for them, which is what will actually turn these kids into fluent readers, right? We have to turn the symbols into words. And then as we map those sounds more and more, our brain will put those in our word form area, which turns them into sight words. And then therefore we become fluent readers, right? So I'm going to read a quote really quickly about the neck or the eye muscles and why they're important. So it says their visual perception, along with their neck holding the head still, allows the eyes to look at an object and keep a steady image of that object. If the eyes cannot track and if the neck cannot hold the head still, the objects and people will appear blurry. So this does start to be developed in the first couple months of life. And so I do want to preface that as well. But the eye muscles and then being able to track without them moving their head is something that's going to develop just a little later on than like the first couple months of their life. So their neck muscles are critical for reading. As the child ages, simple things like raising the head from being on the ground while on their tummy, as I had said, as the neck muscles develop, the child's upper back and arm muscles begin to develop, and they will start to lift themselves to begin crawling, then walking, and so on, like I had said. And so their body is just really trying to understand the feeling of gravity, and that is what is super important in the inner ear. So the vestibular system in the baby's ear is developing, and there are new sensations being sent to the brain in regards to gravity. And this system acts as the internal GPS system. So when it's underdeveloped, you actually can start to notice maybe attention issues, behavioral troubles, things like that. And so like they found even like kids with autism and stuff, their inner ear is usually not fully developed. And so they have a really hard time understanding their body and space. Like there's not a connection happening in their brain there. So all of these work together to improve and learn key movements and motor patterns. And these set the foundations for future academic success. So I'm going to read another quote. This is actually by, what was her name? Jean Ayres is her name. And so she says the eye and neck muscles and inner ear play an important role in organizing the vestibular system. Jean Ayres describes some children with poor vestibular processings have a difficulty tracking an object that is moving in front of them or transitioning their eyes from one spot to another. If they can't track objects in front of them, or they can't transition their eyes from one spot to another, reading words across a page and tracking from line to line, paragraph to paragraph is almost impossible. So like I had said, your eye muscles, your neck muscles, and your inner ear are very, very important. And you're probably wondering like, well, how do I develop those things? Your child has to play. They have to move. One thing that I saw in research is that they said that kids that actually are exposed to uneven surfaces more often actually develop these motor skills at a more advanced rate. So that would be your inner ear, your neck muscles, your eye muscles, all of those things, because when you have to walk on an uneven surface, everything's engaged, right? To try not to fall. And most of our world is not uneven surfaces. Most of our world is flat surfaces. And so really the best place that you can go that's going to have uneven surfaces is maybe, there's, different play areas and stuff that you can go to where they have to climb up things, go down the slides, and they're, trying to balance. That's going to be a good thing to take your child to do so that they can develop those. And then also something free is just to go outside and, go not just in your yard, but go to the mountains if you have mountains, or go somewhere where there is, trees down or whatever, and they have to crawl over things. That is going to be a spot where they can really develop these things. And then again, like I said, if your child's spinning, you're throwing them up in the air, or you're practicing to where, you're having them follow things with their eyes and doing just different little things to help them to develop that. So many times these kids that have those inner ear problems also struggle with balance and coordination. So again, like I said, if you are exposing them to these places that are not flat, right? Uneven surfaces, it's going to help them in developing those things. So I'm going to read a quote from one of the studies. It says, infants and young children aged 4 months to 2 years are dependent on the visual system to maintain balance. At 3 to 6 years of age, children begin to use somatosensory information. Our brain and body connect and understands our position of the body in space. If you know how to say that word, somebody please let me know. Appropriately. Although some studies indicate that development continues until the age of 9 to 11 years. So, as you can see, infants to 2 years of age are very dependent on their visual system to maintain balance. And then as they get older, they begin to use, which really all that weird word is really just like your brain and body connection, right? Understanding your body in space. That's all that really means with the somatosensory information or whatever. And that's when like that inner ear is really, really beginning to develop. Their eye muscles, the neck muscles are becoming more complex, that they are not going to see like that blurry image, right? And some people speculate that still develops up until 9 to 11 years of age. So what does this have to do with reading and writing? So reading and writing does not come naturally in our brain. We are actually rewiring the brain when we are teaching children to read and write. We are a species that is really good at verbal, right? We can communicate through our oral language really, really well. We can listen, but the actual part of having symbols and having those represent sounds and then making words and so on is not actually a natural process. We have not even had the alphabetical code for that long because we used to use like symbols or different pictures that had meanings and so on. And I actually talk about that in the Science of Reading podcast. If you missed that, I talk about our progression and how we got to the alphabetic code, but it hasn't been long that it's been around. So what parts of the brain do we use to learn to read and to write? Most of what's happening is actually happening in the temporal lobe on the right side of the brain. So there is one part that is the frontal lobe, which has to do with pronunciation and articulation, which is going to be how they produce the sounds in, like, for example, like the R sound is really hard for very young kids. And that's really just kind of normal until about age 7 or 8. If they've had extensive practice with it and they still can't do it, then it is a concern. But it is pretty much the temporal lobe that is really the part that is important in reading and writing. The visual word form area, like I had said, is very important in the success for reading and writing. And the visual word form area is where the words we are mapping become sight words. This is in the temporal lobe and responsible for storing information, long-term memory, and interpreting sounds. So the more developed that is, the easier it is going to be for your child to read and write. So now we are getting to the point where I'm going to go over the early literacy skills that are going to be the most important for your child to develop. So the first one is going to be, like I said, oral vocabulary. If we do not have an oral vocabulary, it's going to be very hard for us to read and to write, because if we don't have that word in our vocabulary, it's really hard to read it. As you can see in the example, I had never actually heard of somatosensory. And I'm probably still saying it incorrectly, but because I didn't have that prior to me reading this, right, in my oral vocabulary, it was harder for me to read it. That is how children feel. So you need to make sure that you're reading to them, you're speaking to them, you're exposing them to a bunch of words that are not going to be used in day-to-day conversation, right? So if you're having them even listen to audiobooks and you are reading an array of different genres, this is going to help them to develop language they might not have heard in day-to-day conversation. The next thing is fostering a love for reading. Again, fostering a love for reading is going to be just reading to your child. This will also help them to understand concepts of print as you are reading. They will start to understand this is the front of a book, this is the back of the book, and you can talk to them about what an author is and what an illustrator is and what they do. And then also, if you are pointing to the words as you read, this is going to tell them that, oh, we read from left to right. This is the way, the direction we flip pages, and so on. There's a lot that needs to happen so that they can understand, like, oh, this is, what a book is and how I would read this thing that we're now playing with or whatever. I do want to preface as well, if you are reading with a toddler, it is okay if they are running around and playing as you read, because they are not going to sit down for a very long time. Their attention spans are very short. So reading with your toddler might look like you sitting on the floor and you reading a book, and they're maybe paying attention for, maybe 10 seconds, 15 seconds, maybe a minute, depending on how old they are. And then maybe they walk away, they grab a toy, maybe they come back, and that is okay. You can just keep reading, and you can reread that story many times, right? They're going to like that. Kids of that age do like repetition. So fostering a love for reading, you can also do audiobooks. So if you have kids that are a little bit more, they don't love to read as much, you can have them listen to audiobooks. This is still going to be a story. They're still going to learn. I love audiobooks as an adult because I can multitask, right? I can learn something while I clean the house or whatever it is. So audiobooks are a great way to foster a love of reading and also to grow their oral vocabulary. And then also play. Play is going to be so important. You can actually use play and learn at the exact same time. And I actually have a bunch of reels on how you can practice letters and use play. I also have a blog post about that. It's called 15 Engaging Ways to Practice the Alphabet. And I just literally use play and games to help them learn their letter sounds. So you can check that out for some information, but incorporating that play in your child's interests is going to be helpful in helping them to learn foundational skills. And then we're going to also want to work on phonological awareness. Now, this one is completely auditory. So this is like rhyming. This is counting words in a sentence. If they don't even grasp what a word is, it's going to be very hard for them to identify a word when you're teaching them to read. So they need to be able to hear it, because when you think about it, like I want you to think about listening to someone else speak another language. You have no idea when a word is beginning and ending if you don't speak that language, right? Like it's really hard for you to understand that. And so for them to understand that this is a word, because we have words that are multisyllabic or have multiple syllables, really, that's all that means. And it sounds like it's not just one word, but multiple words. So unless, if I was saying butterfly and they've never heard of a butterfly or seen a butterfly, it might sound like multiple words to them. And you will see this. If you ask kids to count a word, use a multisyllabic word like basketball or butterfly, and they'll go like this. You would say, tell me how many words are in my sentence. I saw a butterfly. They're going to do this. I saw a butterfly. They're going to just naturally break it up into multiple words. So it's important that they can identify a word and what makes a word. And that is a part of phonological awareness, working on syllables. So, I've done a whole breakdown of all of these phonological awareness skills on a YouTube video. If you want to check that out, you can. So you can check out my YouTube on that. But again, working on those auditory skills and just understanding our language and how we can actually break our words up into chunks like rhymes or syllables or just into words, right? Counting each word and then going even more into depth and being able to segment and blend individual sounds in a word. And that is really what they're going to be doing when they go to read. They're going to have to identify the word. They're going to have to identify maybe the syllables. If it's multisyllabic, can they identify the syllables or the vowels? That's all a syllable is. Can they break those apart? Do they understand how to segment those individual sounds and blend them back together to make a word, right? And if we can practice that in the auditory sense, then when they actually have the word in front of them, it's going to take less brain power for them to be able to, now that all they have to think about is, okay, what is this letter sound and what is it going to say? Instead of like, okay, what is this letter sound? What is it going to say? Now I have to practice trying to segment these sounds and blend it back together. And blending is a really hard skill for kids to do. So if we can do it in the auditory sense, when they go to do it with print, it's going to be a lot easier for them to do it. And then the very last thing is going to be letter names and sounds. You can always practice letter names and sounds with your child, right? Start with the letters in their name. Also in my letter blog, I go through like the order that I would suggest teaching letters in, because you want to make sure that you separate like any letters that either sound the same or look the same. That's going to make it a lot easier for them to get those down, because we do have something in our brain called mere generalization, which means that when I see a dog in any position, it is still a dog, and our brains are just wired that way, because that would be really weird, right? If you saw a dog in a different position and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, that's not a dog because it's not the right, so our brains do have that ability, and they use that when they're looking at letters. So it's important that when you are teaching letters, you are separating letters that sound the same, and I mean like how you produce them in your mouth, and then also the ones that look the same, because to kids, they are the same, like B's and D's and P's and Q's and N's and U's. They're just flipped to them. So making sure you separate those. And then I also talk about letter reversals. If you are interested in that, again, I have a blog post on that you can check out, so that you can help them differentiate between those letters that do look the same. But you can teach those letters, letter names and sounds to your child. And all of those skills are very foundational that you can incorporate in your everyday life, that are going to be super important in getting them to become fluent readers and writers. So we're going to go back to my question. Is my child too young to learn to read and write? First of all, do they have a good oral vocabulary? Do they have concepts of print? Do they understand what a front, back of the book? Do they understand we read from left to right? Can they point to a word on a page? Do they have phonological awareness? Can they break words up into syllables in the auditory sense? Can they tell you how many words are in a sentence? Can they tell you how many sounds are in the word cat, or tell you the sounds in the word cat, like k, at, right? Can they do those things? Do they have their letter names and sounds? If they have all of those things, then sure, start teaching them how to segment and blend 2-letter words, and then 3-letter words, and then 4-letter words, and so on, and building upon, again, like we do in everything else, right? They're going to hold their head up, and then they're going to try to lift their body up, and then they're going to start crawling. Same thing with reading. You have to start with the foundations, and if they have those foundations, then you can start to build upon each skill, and it becomes more complex as you move through these skills, right? So is your child too young? I don't know. That is really something that you have to determine based on the information I just provided you, right? Maybe you're like, you know what, my child doesn't have these foundational skills. I'm going to start working on those first, and then we'll go from there. And that is totally fine. And that is what I would suggest, right? It is your child and you know your child best. So you are going to be the best one to answer that question. But that is what's happening in your child's brain and the ages it is happening. So I hope that this podcast was helpful and that you can take something from this and decide what skill your child needs if they are missing these foundations and where to go from there. And that's really the best we can do is where is my child and where do we go next? So I hope you have success in your learning and continuing your learning, and we will see you next time.